All right. Welcome to Life Class on November the 20th. We're so glad to be here again. And also to those of you who are listening online, we have a topic this morning that is a question that we all ask ourselves. We ask each other. And we're going to again ask ourselves this morning, and that is this question. Why is it so darn hard to love ourselves? Why would we do anything in the world for our friends sometimes and yet be so self-condemnatory? So we're taking a look at some of these 60 characteristics that we've talked about. And this is a super common one. And it's judging ourselves really harshly. And it's been found that people who suffer from some of these dynamics of complex post-traumatic stress syndrome, of people that had any kind of complex trauma going on during their life, tend to be really hard on themselves. They tend to beat themselves up in their minds a lot. And so I want to explore a little bit of that with you today to understand kind of what's going on, why we do that, and 3, look at some steps toward healing. Let me give you a definition that somebody has said. When other people make mistakes, we may forgive them readily, but that's not a response to ourselves when we make a mistake. We feel a need to punish ourselves. We're kind to other people, and we may set very low standards for them. But when it comes to ourselves, we set impossibly high standards that usually can never be reached. We believe that other people deserve to be treated kindly, but not us. So let me give you some examples, and some of you may relate readily to these. You might, on a regular basis, find your brain saying to you something like this. You sure are stupid. You're really ugly. You're just not attractive. You're just not like normal people. You're not like other people, in a very negative way. Or if you're looking to start a new job, start a new career, in your brain you might hear, oh, well, you'll never be successful at that. Or, no one will ever appreciate how hard you really work. Or, you're under too much pressure. You know you can't handle this type of job. Negative, negative, negative in your mind. And then it could be when a person gets into relationships, they might hear from their brain, oh, they don't really care about you. You are better off on your own. Or you're going to screw it up anyway. Or if you're vulnerable, you're going to get hurt. So just don't even try to go there. Okay, so that's what I mean by judging yourself harshly. All this stuff that goes on in our head that's very negative. So there's really maybe 3 reasons that we think are important to understand that as we develop as individuals, what happens in our brain is that we sort of learn how to take care of ourselves as sort of our own little parent as we grow and develop. Now, how do we learn that? Well, one of the first places that we start to learn that is that we listen to how other authority parents, other authority figures treat us. And certainly this doesn't have to be about our parents. We can have lovely parents and very healthy in the home, but it could be other caretakers. It could be people we've talked a good bit about church abuse, so this could be figures that have been in churches that we grew up with, but other authority figures. So if we grew up in an environment where we are criticized all the time, most all the time, where we're disrespected, where we're abused, where we're neglected, our little brains assimilate all that information. And so it says, okay, kid, child, this is who you are. What these people are saying, this is who you are. You're not good enough. So a little inner parent begins to form in here. and it parents yourself the same way. And it becomes an internal parent that begins to develop as you grow in your brain. So when you leave your biological parents and you move out on your own at some point, you don't just say, okay, I'm done with you, internal parent that's forming. You can stay home. You can stay home with all the stuff in my room that I don't want, and mom's going to turn my room to a gym or a guest room or whatever. You bring it with you. And out we go out the front door, the suitcases or whatever it is. And so you keep parenting yourself the way you were parented. Well, guess what? We're going to kind of change the name a little bit. Instead of internal parent, I'm going to now have an internal critic. Sounds a little bit more grown up, but it's really not. It's the same stuff. It's the same voices. It's still here. It's still within you. And it's always, let me move this up into the head a little bit. It's a little bit more grown up, more from the limbic brain into the cerebral cortex. It's always chattering, 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 chattering in your brain constantly. So it's another way to say that what happens at a complex trauma level, this activity that goes on before, could be from being criticized, could be some level of abuse, at least what the child tracks down as being wounded or being hurtful, neglect, feeling abandoned, some sort of shame develops. We've talked about this already, even in our couple of months of class, how shame works. But it says, I'm not good enough. Nobody will ever love me because I'm really not lovable. I must not have value. I'm inferior in some way. And it may not be that these words actually play out, but there's enough of a seed of doubt in there. Perhaps I'm not lovable. Perhaps I'm inferior. Perhaps everybody else got the manual for living and I didn't get it. So now this inner critic basically takes those messages of shame. Now we'll talk a little bit more adult-like. Beliefs of shame about who I am at the core. I have some shameful beliefs about who I am at my core. Of course, we don't know this. This is all the stuff that when you get to a certain point, you think, whoa, I feel messed up. I didn't need to discover who I really am. I couldn't be all this chattering in my head. And then maybe we go to a group or something happens in our life where we just finally have to realize that I need to kind of look at my life and this couldn't be all that there is. Maybe my thinking's messed up. So this continual parroting back and forth of these things about us to us that are extremely damaging or destructive, or maybe they're just not helpful. I had someone way into their 70s the other day come to me with just this and just was besieged, hadn't slept in nights, and had never had any basic help on this. So afraid to go to any kind of a gathering in public because it would mean admitting that she had any kind of thoughts that were outside of the norm. And it was just, oh my goodness, how long people hold out in society with this reign of terror up here. I had so much compassion for her. So this is, we all have needs as we come into the world. We talk about those 12 needs, physical, emotional, relational, spiritual. And when those needs are not met due to anything that we sort of experience as abuse, abandonment, neglect, the child develops a belief system about itself, about life, about happiness, about our place in the world. And as we go through life as a person, a developing person, that belief system becomes a belief system of the inner critic. And so all that time, that belief system is like a filter through which we experience the world. And it tells us that that's true, that what is going on is true. But in reality, it's not. They're untruths. There are lies. There are distortions. You know, we've talked a little bit about things like a mistrained conscience, false guilt. I hope it's caused you to question some of your thinking that's making you miserable so far. And hopefully some solutions. And we'll have some of those later in our talk today. There are, as our the course, Tim Fletcher and some of the material I reviewed before putting together to teach the class, there are two main ways that are presented of how we judge ourselves harshly. The first is mentally, which is this inner critic I'm describing. There's a series of different writers who have put together some quotes about the inner critic, and I hope that these might be helpful for you. So here's some authors that I will just highlight in just a few quotes. Here's the first one. The inner critic refers to an inner voice that judges, criticizes, or demeans us. Whether or not the self-criticism is objectively justified, whether or not it's true, a highly active inner critic can take a toll on one's emotional well-being and self-esteem. Hit home with anybody? Pretty introverted. And so it is this inner voice that judges, criticizes, and demeans or puts us down. Here's another quote. The critical inner voice is a well-integrated pattern of destructive thoughts towards ourselves and others. The nagging voices or thoughts that make up this internalized dialogue are at the roots of much of our self-destructive behavior. And then another one. The critical inner voice is not an auditory hallucination. It is experienced as thoughts within your head. This stream of destructive thoughts forms an anti-self that discourages individuals from acting in their own best interest. And I love that because I think that personally, over the years of growing up, I have heard that voice assigned so many different labels. When I was over in the world of fundamentalist religion, I was told that it was Satan, the Antichrist. When I was over in the world of intense cerebral psychology, I was described as the ego, the superego, other types of figures. You know, I've just been all over the place in my years in my life about what that voice actually was. So imagine my aha moment about 30 years ago when I ran across these types of moments of clarity in working with people who were able to bring science, biology, and truth together so that I was able to very clearly identify this and be able to live much more of a simpler, truer, clearer life and emerge out of the muck of the pond, so to speak, and into more of some of the wisdom traditions and reading things that were very, very enriching and enlightening rather than staying in my own head for long periods of time. So this little anti-self, I would agree with that. It's a voice that's against the best, truest, most loving, creative part of us. It keeps us paralyzed and imprisoned. So it keeps us from growing and developing a larger self. It keeps us from enlarging our soul in healthy and divine ways. This little inner voice that I'm talking about is not your conscience. That's another thing I was told, that it probably is your conscience. So you can imagine a much younger me having these thoughts and saying, well, then that's probably the voice of God. That's probably your conscience. You know, it's spinning around in my mind, being instructed by people in authority. Who in the world do I listen to? This is just all one big conflicted soup. So you all may be hearing the same things. You may have had the same struggles. It's very, very, very important who you listen to, because it's often things that well-intended parents or others may have said to us when we were younger. They learned it, and they bought it, and they had their own struggles as a result. So I think that there's another thing that has been said, and this is an anonymous quote. Your inner critic reaffirms untruths about yourself that you have internalized to be true. I'm going to read that again. Your inner critic reaffirms untruths about yourself that you have internalized to be true. And here's another one. As far as your inner critic is concerned, you are never good enough. No matter what you do, it will always find something to criticize. No matter what you do, it will always find something to criticize. I find that if you can kind of have lists of types of things that have descriptive words, it is also helpful. And I'm not saying that this little short list covers this by any reason, because I think inner critics can be unlimited, but I'd like to try to give you 7 that come from some of this material I was trained with. And these are 7 types of inner critics. And the first one we had an entire lesson on several weeks back, which is the perfectionist. The perfectionist sets this unreachable bar of perfection, both for your own task and also for your relationships. You can never attain it, and it is constantly criticizing you because you're not perfect. The bar is always changing, always going higher. And you can refer back to your audio on that if you like to review. And the number 2 is what's called the inner controller. You may find this one interesting, and here's how it works. Whenever you have an impulse that you might say is sort of like an unhealthy or feels kind of like a dark impulse, like I'm just going to kind of let it all go and I'm going to eat whatever I want. Not a well-deserved sort of a treat. You know, you can rein it back in, but I'm talking about a big old binge where I don't care about myself. I don't care about my body. I'm just going to, do this. Or have an impulse in a sexual area that's not healthy, an impulse that for somebody who is trying to get sober, let's say they just want to use drugs, the minute that they get out of rehab, any kind of impulse like that. And or have an impulse even though you don't give into it, even though you don't entertain it, even though you don't feed it. Just having that impulse right there within you, right in front of you, causes that inner critic to shame you. So you're feeling shame for feeling tempted or having an impulse. So what that thinks it's doing is protecting you from failure. You feel the shame spiral starting. Oh, I'm so bad for having this impulse. There's no acceptance there. There's no, I'm a human being. God help me, this is normal. Let me just pause for 90 seconds. It'll pass. No, none of that. No tools. No healthy tools present. But shame. There I go again. I'm always going to be this way. I'm worthless. I'll never get any better. See, all that negative stuff starts. So that will make you just feel defeated by giving into the thinking associated with that impulse. And guess what? It's the great backfire effect. Eventually the person will spiral down and they will give in to it. How many times after a weekend on someone who's really trying to clean up their lifestyle, will they go back in their thinking and tell me how the wheels fell off? It's just this cycle right here. The third one is called the taskmaster. Sort of the third type of the inner critic, the taskmaster. And this is the one where its concern is that you work hard and be successful. It doesn't want you to be mediocre or lazy or to fail. And the thing is, it gets so out of balance, it just pushes you all the time. You can't relax. You've got to do more and more and more. And this is one that, this is what I called it like 40 years ago, my slave driver. I named it my slave driver. It drives you like a slave driver, trying to prevent you from being what you fear is going to be like a disaster in your job if you don't perform at peak performance in your job. But again, it backfires because you're so driven that eventually you will burn out. You just get so overwhelmed with the stress of it all. Nobody can tolerate that kind of pressure 24/7 for that many years. So what happens to a lot of people is that they begin to procrastinate, and then they feel like they failed themselves if they're not moving fast enough. It comes in many forms. A fourth one they call the underminer. And this one doesn't want you to put yourself out there in a way where you're taking a risk. A good calculated risk even. To try something new to grow. It undermines your self-confidence and your self-esteem. It's that thing that's always trying to keep you in a little box where you're small, so you never fail, so you never run the risk of looking bad, so you never, ever could get hurt, so you never run the risk of getting rejected. So basically, it's always undermining your self-worth. It's feeding the shame, and it's saying, oh no, you can't do that. You can't take that risk. You'll fail. You're not good enough to try that. So it keeps you stuck in this little box that prevents growth. And the person never does, because it undermines any attempts or thoughts in that direction. And people can stay there for years. It actually grows comfortable for people because it's the known. It's miserable, but it's known. So this prevents attempts to improve and enrich one's life. The fifth one, and this sounds very violent in the tone of this word, it's called the destroyer. But there are many ways to destroy a life that don't come with weapons. There's many ways we can destroy our lives bit by bit. This one is so controlled by fear that basically it constantly feeds our shame. It attacks us, and it just makes us feel so flawed or inadequate that we just begin to lose our self-respect. We don't like ourselves anymore. It keeps us from wanting to see people. We see this a lot with behaviors that isolate us away from other people. That can be a very gradual process, and sometimes we don't even see it. Or loved ones that we have in this class that we're concerned about. Basically, it's sort of the inner critic as destroyer wanting to make a person feel like they're better off if they don't exist. I'm not talking about actually suicide, but just somebody that feels like it's the risk of hurt is too much, and I'm just sort of better off not being seen, so I'm going to hole up here, and there's a big continuum between that and having a plan for actually exiting the world. There's a big continuum there. The sixth one is the guilt tripper. Oh boy. This is the one that's always bringing up your failures from the past and criticizing you. It's not a person. It's this. It's this thing. And it's the one that just makes it unable for you to forgive yourself for something that you may have done or people that you have hurt. Most of the time, it is an imaginary thing. There's no data to even show that you could have done anything else or that these people were actually hurt. It's really interesting. Sometimes there's no factual basis. And it's always saying justice requires you punish yourself. You don't deserve a good life because of the things that you have done. So you will see people always sabotaging anything that is good, putting themselves down, beating themselves up. So the problem with this is that it always brings in those false guilt things that you think you have done wrong. Now, there is really wrong done, which is going to be legitimate guilt, of course, in those cases. All right? So that's one thing. But when false guilt may have been things that were told in the past that we did wrong, but really we didn't do anything wrong. So it's important to separate that out. So now if we set a boundary with someone, the person can get upset with us and they don't like it. They give us flack. All right? So now the inner critic will say, you're such a terrible person for setting those boundaries. You're so selfish because you set a boundary. So this is the one that can never be satisfied, as we repeat this cycle. Are any of you familiar with that? You get an adverse reaction or even a raised eyebrow or just the fear that we have of doing something different. And so this is the one that in a sense says, okay, what kind of jail term do I have to pay for my sins? This inner critic, you're never going to pay your jail term. Your sentence will never be served. You'll be criticized or beaten up in prison for the rest of your life because this keeps kind of like playing out with certain people, in your life. The final one, number 7, is called the conformist. And this is the one that's really concerned with fitting in socially. I'm always going to feel like the oddball. I'm going to feel like the black sheep that's rejected. And it just constantly monitors everything that you do and that you say in social settings. Like you go to a party and then the next day it's like you have a little video camera inside you and you're going back on what did I say? What did I look like? What was the expression on their face when I said this, when I said that? It's a real prison. And it bases its standard on what your family taught you, what your culture says you need to do to fit in socially. And if you ever should show a part of your personality that doesn't quite fit the social norms, it shames you and causes you to think, well, surely I'll be rejected. Surely I'll be abandoned. And it just sort of comments on everything that you say and do. So the replaying of the tapes of everything you said and did in a social setting, constantly criticizing you. Well, what will people think about that? Oh, you were so stupid when you said that. So it's a basic fear that we will be unacceptable. Now, not only is that misery, but it prevents us from the authenticity. It prevents us from the life of abundance and love, which is the will of God, which is the will of our Creator. And there's only one you, a unique, individual one of you, as God has made you. And the whole point in development through life is to open this up so that you may expand instead of shutting down into this funnel that is prevented from authentic expression. So again, this little box of the social norms. So those are 7 different types. And did some of you have more than one, perhaps? More than one? Okay. I've had them all probably at different times. And just the monitoring of every part of your life. So, you know how people years ago would say, Big Brother's watching you and you know, have a sense about, you know, the Russians are spying on everything, and now it's you know, all of the thing about cameras everywhere and social media is tracking everything. Well, we ought to be used to it because we have this in here. It's tracking everything that we do. Everything that we do. What if we could just let that go and be present? It keeps us from ever growing. It keeps us from getting healthy. It's a terrible thing to have in our head. And so this is the very first way that we beat ourselves up, is mentally. Now, that's the first way. The second way you may not have going on in your life at all, but you may have somebody that you love that you're very concerned about or seeing. And this is self-harm. Sometimes it's physical harm, but it takes various forms. It's really hard to understand sometimes. I have lots of grandparents that come to me about their grandchildren or an adolescent that they know. So studying the science of physical cutting or scratching or burning or even kids that or adults who pick at a wound to keep it from healing, pulling of hair. There's one thing. And then there's like eating. There's self-harm with purging and starving, anorexia. There's people who will ingest things that are poisonous. And then, of course, drug and alcohol abuse are a form. Some people will go further than that in order to just not care or flirt with overdosing. And then there's another form of self-harm we'll call risky behaviors. That can be driving crazy in a risky way. We see that on our highways today. We see this in the larger society. We see engaging in crime, unprotected sex, sort of flirting with the edge of life and death, as we see so much in our society, suicide attempts, the world of dangerous extreme sports, sort of the T-type thrill seeker, flirting with great danger. So, you know, I've given you 5 or 6, you know, big areas here that we encounter either through the news media or in some sort of touch that we have in life. So the question that we get asked quite a bit is, why do people self-harm if they see how bad it is? Well, they don't. Don't they see how bad it is? No. They can't. Well, don't they see how silly it is? How can I understand why they don't? These are questions, normal questions during the week. I think that the one thing that we can know is maybe that everybody with any of these tendencies towards self-harm has intense emotional pain that they have not been taught how to resolve in a healthy way at some point. That's what we can say about it at some level. So it sits there, and they have no way of getting rid of it. And so that can come through all kinds of different negative emotions. It could be anger or rage, just all pent up inside them, tremendous frustration, many losses never dealt with, rejection, disrespect, guilt, loneliness, failure, complete loss of control, as in some of the impulse disorders, feeling totally hopeless. And we could go on and on and on, and I'm not saying that I know but just a fraction of things. So we talked about what happens when people cut themselves or do physical harm a few weeks back, about with hormones, how the physical pain medicates the emotional pain for just a little bit. And also when, let's say, a teenager cuts themselves, it releases brain chemicals that provide a bit of a release of that emotional pain. So for them at that point in time, that's an added benefit in their mind. And then it's really easy to become addicted to those chemicals that are released. So the person needs to keep self-harming just to get those chemicals again in their brain. And for some, they self-harm as a way to control their life. Maybe if their parents are constantly trying to over-control every aspect of their life. So some have written that self-harm is a way they can regain some control over what they do to themselves. At least they feel that way. They see it that way. And then for some, self-harm can be a way to hurt those closest to them. Kind of like this. This is taken from a lot of different excerpts of real dialogue. Hey, you controlling parents, I'm going to hurt myself because I know it'll hurt you. And that'll punish you for trying to control me. And so, that would be the logic sometimes there in extreme situations. So all those things are part of physical self-harm that people do. Now, how does a person heal when it comes to this area of judging ourselves harshly? Well, studies show that when we judge ourselves really harshly, if we were raised that way, it seems really logical that we could use it to control ourselves, discipline ourselves in good ways, motivate ourselves to change. What studies have found that it actually has the opposite effect over the long run. Instead of motivating us, it demotivates us at a certain point. It keeps us stuck. It keeps us from growing. So there's no benefit that come out of judging ourselves harshly. One of the things that I began doing is just sort of a creative exercise. I went to a workshop that talked about the inner critic and the importance of separating the inner critic out from you. I think this was in like the late 80s, early 90s. And in my brain, I thought about, wouldn't it be cool if we could give the inner critic like a name? What about if we could think about, who maybe in our life journey so far represented our inner critic, the most. And this is kind of a version of the old therapy thing where you would have somebody doing the empty chair work, and then you would write a letter and you would read it to the empty chair if that person were deceased or not there, or it wasn't a good idea to confront them directly. And my thought was, what if I could have them pick their inner critic that would be like a real person? That the voice of their inner critic would be most like that person, like their might not be a parent, so forth. So I thought, I'm going to try this out. And I have this little anonymous story to tell with permission. So I was coaching someone that still lived alone, had lots and lots of feline pets, never allowed herself to be uncovered below the neck, was probably the most prim and proper person that I had met outside of the Victorian era. And was just so very, very concerned with every body movement. It was kind of like early robotics when she came in and she would sit down. And she loved tea, so I would always bring her a cup of tea. And again, it was just sort of like early robotics, with the teacup, and everything was so precise. And as much as she wanted to get out of her apartment and live life beyond her feline companions, she was so rigid and so restricted by her inner critic. And we talked about the internal parent. No, that wasn't it. She had one of the most fun-loving mothers who was out gallivanting around the world. And the more that I explored with her where some of this behavior and all this chattering in her head could have come from, she finally hammered kind of through her own concrete and began opening up at about 6 months. And of course, she's given me permission to share this. This was years ago. I said, "So who were you with when your mother was around the world? Parents were divorced." And she said, "I can't talk about it. I was told to never talk about it." And so I said, "Well, obviously these messages came from somewhere." And I began to talk to her about this kind of stuff. And I said, "Well, I want you to give your inner critic a name. I want you to think about the inner critic, male or female, as a character." And her eyes gleamed, and it turned out she'd taken drama in college secretly. Because, she would have loved the costumes. That was her only delight. At least she could watch the costumes and she could see the colors. I mean, this was how afraid she was to enjoy things. So the next session, I watched her get out of the car, and she's in this velvet Victorian suit with a hat and everything. And she gets out, she comes to the door, and I said her name, and she goes, "No, you will call me Aunt Polly." So anyway, she came. She had the imagination enough to come dressed as her Aunt Polly. Aunt Polly had raised her. And Aunt Polly was probably one of the most prim and proper. There's a great aunt, by the way. And she had dedicated her life to raising the perfect little Tea Party English girl, who could make no mistakes. And I'll never forget that, because we all have our Aunt Pollys. It made me recognize my own slave driver. My slave driver was a very cruel person who had a whip. It was like on rawhide out of the Westerns, when I watched when I was a little girl. Yeah. And I was very afraid of that. Very afraid of that. And that really started something in my own life about separating my thoughts from me, separating my inner critic, looking at my own motive. Is this really something that is coming from my inner parent, my inner critic? Is this loving? Is this healthy? Or is this something that I really need to examine and begin to let go of? So Aunt Polly really helped me, and consequently it really helped her. She began to broaden and get past that training in ways that we never, ever thought possible for her. So in this training through this REACT program, Tim Fletcher says, so if you want to give it a name so that you can recognize who your inner critic is mimicking, you can take steps to heal. So if your inner critic speaks up, you can say, "Oh, that's Mom's voice. That's what Mom used to say. Now I know where part of that inner critic came from. Oh, yeah, that could be Dad. That could be Uncle so-and-so. That could be my third grade teacher. That could be my youth pastor." So So the inner critic is made up from people from your past, and that helps you. So the next thing to do is to identify what your inner critic is saying to you. My inner critic could be constantly saying, oh, you're stupid. It's saying you're going to fail. Write down. I had her write down what Aunt Polly was saying. You know, a lady should always keep their legs crossed and their wrists at an angle. A lady should always hold her pinky out when she lifts the teacup. You know, I mean, she was really going back and, you know, all of these kind of things, and explained her body language. I'm just giving you some of the simple parts of it, but you can get the idea. So the old inner critic would say, you know, these things, and then we can say, okay, that's a lie. I can hold my teacup any way I blank will please. No, that's not true. This cuts off my circulation. No, that's not true. I need to be grounded, both my feet on the floor. That's not true. I'm an adult now. I don't ever have to have a cup of tea again if I don't want to. You know, take this and personalize it to the things that really hang you up in your own life. So these voices no longer have power over me. I don't have to let it control me. I can tell it to just shut up. And when I had her tell Aunt Polly to shut up for the first time, it was glorious. Fire was in the curtains, I can tell you that. So when we come to the healing journey and healing shame, it really doesn't matter what the issue is. It's generally shame that feeds it, and it's compassion for ourselves that will heal it. You know, learning to not give it space in our mind and then replace it with accurate stuff. Somebody has said this, when it comes to your inner critic, my advice is not to take advice from anyone who doesn't like you. That's like returning to the perpetrator for healing. So be really careful who you surround yourself with. I want to give you some spiritual vitamins again today. I thought about Advent, particularly because yesterday was the beginning of the Celtic Advent, and that's where my ancestors are from. So in Celtic spirituality in Scotland and England and those regions, they've already begun. They're a little ahead of us. And I'm thinking about the themes of light coming out of darkness. I am beginning to prepare for an out-of-town Advent retreat that I put together each year. And again, themes of light coming out of darkness. So what could be more timely than to look at how darkness can come to us as our inner critic descends, and then how do we actively and intentionally bring in the light? Here are about 9 lights or scriptures or spiritual vitamins that I would say that have stood me very, very well. Those of you who listening online who may not be of the Christian faith, certainly the wisdom traditions, quotations that are special to you, things from the Quran or other worship traditions can enrich this list. But what I have found is that if you cut these apart and just have strips and have them by the door before you go to work, have one in your car, there's just enough for that day, and see which one you pick up, okay? Little chunks are digestible, and see which one is your favorite. I'm going to read through these just to close us out today as a closing prayer, and I will not reference them in speech, but I'll be giving these to you all. And I hope that you will hear this as a blessing which will wash over you, through you, and at least for these minutes replace your inner critic. I thank you, high God. You are breathtaking. Body and soul, I am marvelously made. I worship in adoration. What a creation. No, we neither make nor save ourselves. God does both the making and the saving. He creates each of us by Christ Jesus to join him in the work he does, the good work he has gotten ready for us to do, work we had better be doing. I've found the recipe for being happy, whether full or hungry, hands full or hands empty. Whatever I have, wherever I am, I can make it through anything in the one who makes me who I am. The Master stood by me and helped me spread the message loud and clear to those who had never heard it. I was snatched from the jaws of the lion. God's looking after me, keeping me safe in the kingdom of heaven. We use our powerful God tools for smashing warped philosophies, tearing down barriers erected against the truth of God, fitting every loose thought and emotion and impulse into the structure of life shaped by Christ. Our tools are ready at hand for clearing the ground of every obstruction and building lives of obedience into maturity. Now we look inside, and what we see is that anyone united with the Messiah gets a fresh start, is created new. The old life is gone, and a new life emerges. Just look at it. Those who enter into Christ being here for us no longer have to live under a continuous low-lying black cloud. A new power is in operation. The Spirit of life in Christ, like a strong wind, has magnificently cleared the air. Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and intelligence." This is the most important, the first on any list. But there is a second to set alongside it. Love others as well as you love yourself. Amen.